Welcome to our Thursday, June 15th webcast on the attack on a free and flourishing Canada today and what to do about it. I'm going to take direction from Mark Milke, who I'll be interviewing. He'll be discussing his book, 1876 Project, Why Canada Should Be Cherished and Not Cancelled, and the increasing social or anti-social conflict between personal and public interests. This topic is quite exciting to us. We've visited it several times in a variety of ways during the year, not only what AI is doing, but what was happening with freedom of speech when Frances Widdowson was canceled, who wanted to speak at Lethbridge, and protests made her point. She couldn't speak at the university because of protests. So, Mark, I am really excited to hear what you have to share with us today. I'm going to start off by simply asking you to tell us a little bit about what brought you here. You've obviously got a passion about Canada, for Canada, and about the things that we're all having to weather. So I'm going to say over to you. Tell us a little bit about your career. What brought you to here today?
Well, Perry, thanks for having me on and for being game to discuss the 1867 project, right? A book starting obviously with Confederation, Year of Confederation. Well, about myself, I mean, I've always been interested in history, and that might explain a little bit of the 1867 project and the genesis of the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy, this new think tank that I'm founder and president of. But I grew up in Kelowna, British Columbia. As a kid, I was fascinated by history. Pre-internet, of course, you actually had to read things in this old-fashioned medium called books and encyclopedias. So as a kid, I'd read up on things like Soviet Union or Nazi Germany. I was fascinated for whatever reason by tyrannies. How did tyrannies come about? And how do you fight them? And so I had this deep sort of interest in history and politics early on. And, Kelowna, where I grew up, was a bit of a political side of it as well, I guess. It was the home of two British Columbia premiers, W.A.C. Bennett, 1952 to 1972, premier of the province, hardware store merchant in British Columbia in Kelowna, and his son, Bill Bennett, who was premier when I was 8 years old, starting in 1975 until 1986. So, my older brother used to play in what was called the Bennett Mansion, which is now just a big house compared to what people live in these days. But my older brother used to play on the grounds there in Kelowna. Very different age growing up. But I grew up in Kelowna and love the place, still do, still have family there, get back regularly. But so from there, moved to, did some volunteer work down in the United States, late teens, early 20s, and then moved to Edmonton, got a bachelor's degree at the University of Alberta, spent 2 years in Japan teaching English. That was a fascinating time for me, and learned a lot about myself and others, and come to have a love for East Asia and Japan in particular. There's some things about Japan that I really quite like, from their architecture, kind of Frank Lloyd Wright style architecture, to the simplicity of that, and other things about Japan that I just love. The kindness I encountered there. I came back to Canada, to Alberta, did a master's degree, almost became a lawyer, didn't though, did a master's degree in political science. Worked 5 years for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, starting in Edmonton and then in Victoria, where I published my first book. And moved to Calgary in 2002 to do a doctoral PhD under Tom Flanagan in the political science department at the University of Calgary. And to come to the present, worked for a couple of think tanks over the years, worked for some donor organizations in terms of granting organizations, 2 think tanks. Worked for the former Premier Jason Kenney in the 2019 election campaign, helped put together the platform. So I've had an interesting kind of career, you could say, but maybe the tie between it all is ideas and policy matter, right? And if you get things wrong, if you get ideas right, policy in terms of governments, you can build something that will last a long time. And the image I give to people is, we live in an anti-reality age, I think. There's a lot of, anti-reality ideas out there. And often in politics, politicians will propose something that isn't really connected to reality. The problem with that is when you're connected to reality, it's fundamentally positive. When you think about a skyscraper, let's go back 100 years. If you want to build a skyscraper, what do you do in Manhattan, lower Manhattan, say 100 years ago? Well, you find the right site, you hire a structural engineer, you find the right builders to make sure they do it properly. You measure the wind, the water, the air, all that kind of stuff. And if you get it right, if you construct something that's anchored in reality, what do you get? Well, you get the Empire State Building, or my favorite, the Chrysler Building, and it's still standing 100 years later. If you get it wrong, and this is when I give speeches about this, I throw up a picture of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, right? So when you're not connected to reality, you end up, in a car crash, or when you're building buildings, a defective building. So a lot of my career has been trying to bring people back to reality. Is probably the best way to put it, or get policy out there that helps people and not hurts people. So that's been a big part of my career, is just saying, look, is this policy in touch with reality? Whether it's on taxes, whether it's something more recent on, history. Is it a good idea to cancel history, or is that a bad idea? I think it's a bad idea, as we'll get into. But a lot of my career can be summed up in terms of, I want us to be in touch with reality because I think it's fundamentally positive. And if you're not, it's a problem. And also, I want people to be free and to flourish. I just think, human creativity, ingenuity, self-actualization, to use the psychological terms, is helped when people are free to explore, to debate, to succeed. And a lot of my career has been about promoting that.
Let me zero in a little bit on the career before we dive into the book for a minute.
Sure.
I too found history. I was 8. I think it was 8 years old when I learned who Mussolini was, who Hitler was, and who Stalin was. And when Stalin died, I remember carving initials on my headboard of my bedroom, because that seemed to be a magical day that such a bad dude would have died. And I felt at that time, I need to know more about these things. And I think that was the beginning of my own personal interest in history. But I understand from talking to my son that history is not readily addressed in the educational system today. And you talk about geography, kids don't even know the structure of Canada, much less where Germany might be.
Right.
Why would we be wanting to go through so much revisionism about history? I'd like you to sort of open up a little bit. Why at this particular point in time are we so down on understanding history at all?
Well, one of the reasons, what I'll get to in a moment, actually, but you brought up something, Perry, that I think is useful to talk about as well. The fact that Stalin existed, or Hitler, as I mentioned earlier, I was fascinated again by the tyrannies that developed in the 20th century. What was the core problem? Well, what I figured out, in my view, and I'm not the first to observe this, is that concentrated power is the danger, right? When you give all the chips, so to speak, to one person, one institution, watch out, right? Because what's the famous phrase from Lord Acton? Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. What we've learned over the last, I would say, 500 years, or especially in the Anglosphere, the last half millennia, is that concentrated power is a danger, and you actually literally have to institutionally separate it out. So even going back, almost 900 years now to the Magna Carta, that was a limitation on the power of the king. They couldn't just come in and take your property, and basically a system was set up to review attempts to do so, right? The courts and so on and so forth. Concentrated power is a problem. So how do you deal with that? Well, the Americans, for example, set up a system where you have Congress, you have the Senate, the House of Representatives rather, and the Senate and the White House, and you have a judicial branch. That's deliberate. They didn't want another king after George III. In the Canadian tradition, we take the parliamentary tradition. In theory, anyway, Parliament's supposed to hold the executive to account. So this is a fundamentally good thing. The danger in human history is when people have concentrated power, and people often make this mistake. They become utopian, and they say, if only we had the right leader. They look to people as a savior. Big mistake. No one's going to save you. The institutions, if they're properly set up and respected, will. Now, to your question, that's one of the things we've learned in history, right? That power corrupts. So it's not that people don't mean well, but lots of people get into power thinking they'll do the right thing, and either they can't or they're corrupted by power.
Let me come back. Let me come back to that for a moment, because it's one thing to accumulate power in the interest of pursuing your utopia. It's another thing to concentrate power because you're in a crisis.
Well, you can do that, but again, I think the ends might be the same if it's endured too long. Even Winston Churchill. I'm president of the local Sir Winston Churchill Society here in Calgary. I don't pretend to be an expert. Winston Churchill imprisoned was it Oswald Mosley during the war for a time, and then let him out because he didn't want to replicate the kind of repression he saw across the Atlantic, across the Strait rather, the Channel. It's the word I'm looking for. So I want us to be very careful about the powers that are gathered up in wartime. Again, there's an exception every rule. There's a reason why government exists, but again, it can't hold all the cards, so to speak. So that's what I've learned from history.
The point I'm trying to get at is the word crisis. If you can create a crisis, you can create the grounds for which you might be able to centralize power. And it seems to me one of the things we seem to be going through as a society, whether it be COVID, whether it be supply chain disruption, whether it be debt, it seems to me we're going from crisis to crisis, which is creating the argument that maybe we need to look a little bit more like China, where centralized power can make some immediate decisions and fix these things.
No, I mean, I wouldn't take China as an example at all, because then again, you get the, you get the negative, and there's a lot of negative that goes along with autocracies and tyrannies. So no, I think actually you want a liberal democratic order. The temptation to concentrate power and say, well, we get things done. Well, that's the problem. Tyrants get things done. They starve Ukraine, or they start the Holocaust, or, lesser evils. They take all your money and run with it and spend it on something stupid, or just disrupt the economy to such an extent like Robert Mugabe did in Zimbabwe, that you throw everyone into poverty, or they cause hyperinflation, as some Latin American ideos have done. So democracy is not perfect, but it's not meant to be perfect. And back to your initial question, sort of what's going wrong here? Why don't people learn from history or think about history? Insofar as they do these days, and this was the genesis for the 1867 project, why Canada should be cherished, not canceled, the book we've just released at the Aristotle Foundation. I think actually the problem today is a lot of people think simplistically about history, and some are utopians. And I find this with the progressive left. It's not just them, but they are utopians. And what I mean by that is, in the 20th century, one of the utopian movements was Marxism, was communism, but they at least had an excuse. They looked to the future to create their perfect world, their utopia. It was always going to be wrong. They were wrong about human motivations and what they were going to achieve on a whole number of levels. They were economically illiterate. Nonetheless, they at least could have the excuse, well, we will create this utopia in the future by tinkering here and tinkering there, or governing in a certain way. We have people today that look to the past, which by definition is done, and expect it to be perfect. And it's utopian. We have imperfect human beings in history. Everyone on this video is imperfect. You and I, Perry, are imperfect. 100 years from now, people will look at you and me, Perry, and say, what were you thinking about issue X? Because you can't possibly, of course, be omniscient. In our short lifespan, 60 years, 80 years, 100 years, if you make it that far, we can't know everything. We're not God. And so, but we've got people today that look to the past and somehow either think it should have been perfect, or that somehow in 1867 or 1920, they should have had our views. And there's a bit of hubris there as well, that somehow we're completely right on every issue. And the danger is, instead of looking at history, at least in I would say the Anglosphere especially, where again, we learned about the separation of powers, we came to value the individual as worth something morally equal to every other individual, through the influence of Judaism and monotheism and Christianity and the Enlightenment, all of that. There's a danger that when people look at history and think, because you weren't perfect back then, we should just dispense with the project, so to speak, not understanding that building a country, building a civilization is like an oak tree. If you take the seed, the acorn, and you want to, the beauty of an oak tree is what? It's one of my favorite trees. The beauty of an oak tree is that you're sheltered underneath this massive canopy. Well, that's like a country that's succeeding, that's free, that's flourishing. You get from an acorn to a massive oak tree with what? Water, wind, nutrients, all of those matter to making sure the tree grows. Well, the country is the same thing. What do you need in a country to succeed, to be free and flourish? Well, you need freedom of expression, which is kind of like sunshine. You need the freedom to debate and see where the flaws are, and that's sunshine, that's free expression. You need water, you need nutrients, which is ideas. You also need wind, you need resistance. You need people to push back just in case you're wrong. But today, literally, we have people going, I don't want free expression. I don't want the sunshine that will expose my bad ideas, perhaps. I don't want resistance. I don't want wind. They don't want nutrients. They don't want to, read too deeply or think too deeply. And in fact, someday, and they look at a limb on a tree that's diseased, And again, you look back at Canadian history and you think about, wrong things that have been there, right? Again, the discrimination against indigenous folk who didn't have the vote before 1960. That was a diseased limb, that policy. Well, what you do is you don't take down the entire tree, the entire oak tree. What you do is you cut off the diseased limb. You reform the policy. You give Indigenous Canadians a vote in 1960. That in fact strengthens the tree. That strengthens Canada, to use the analogy. So, but we've got people today who think simplistically, something bad happened in history. We should just ignore all of Canadian history or pretend it was all bad. And it's self-defeating. No, we built on the sacrifices and successes of the past. And in fact, the ideas out of the 19th century of, say, classical liberalism, that value the worth of the individual. And that came from somewhere. And if you eliminate that somewhere, because you're toppling the oak tree, you're actually doing yourself a disservice. You're poisoning or taking out the roots of a very successful oak tree that has sheltered many people.
Okay, while we feel, and I think generally that we have gained enormously as a byproduct of liberalism, but there's also this concept that we can exceed it. That neoliberalism can be excessive, where individuals can say anything they bloody well want without responsibility, implying that you don't need to be socially conscious. All you need to do is express your individuality. Well, that becomes a bit excessive. That's where your dictators come in. So how do we balance this? Where you talk about the balance of power in government, the balance of power at the individual level is to teach people about social responsibility and not just about the power and the relevance of their individuality.
Right. Yeah. It's, well, rights and responsibility, right? They go together. They're two wings, so to speak, of the bird. And this is my other concern, and another reason we've set up the Aristotle Foundation, because I want to discuss, we want people, get some professors and others, those who have some, deep thoughts on the subject, to analyze what's happening on that, and to talk about the need to be responsible. It's not just, assert your rights. That's part of it in the history of the Western tradition. We want people to have rights attached to the individual, so they can be free to flourish. But people also need to be responsible. And of course, there's, again, we named this after Aristotle for a reason. There's a long history in the Western tradition, and I assume others, but in the Western tradition, dating back to ancient Greece, of talking about what kind of society we want. And part of that is, it's not just about rights, it's about your responsibility to others, right? Or in the Christian tradition, love your neighbor, so on and so forth. And there's other traditions that emphasize the same. So I don't know if it's possible to have a balance, so to speak, but it's a bit of an art, not an exact science. I can tell you where I think we're being irresponsible. Let me give you an example from Japan. When I was there, there was an English newspaper publication, and there was a English writer who was originally Canadian. She married a Japanese fellow. I remember a column she wrote about an event in Vancouver, and apparently, I'm going from memory, but it was something to the effect of, like, a grandmother had backed her car into someone somewhere in Vancouver, backing down her lane or whatever. And the person was injured. And someone sued this grandmother for all she was worth, apparently. And I remember the Japanese columnist, again, a person from Canada originally, was horrified at this for a whole bunch of reasons. She said, first of all, it was an accident. And second of all, no one in Japan would ever sue a grandmother because of an accident and make them penniless, basically, and poor. And that spoke to the responsibility side of the equation we have. Just because we have a right to do something doesn't mean we should do something. So again, I think this is a bit of an art, and maybe I don't have a perfect remedy for this. And part of this is maybe the decline of respect, for elders, right? That part of the Old Testament ethic, for example. Respect your respect your parents, respect, those who are older than you.
We've talked not to get just, but we've talked about the evolution of artificial intelligence, and where is the moral compass in artificial intelligence, so that it is in fact acting responsibly. Well, the moral compass in Japan may be slightly different than the moral compass in India or in Germany or whatever. So one can envision multiple forms of AI as moral compasses get incorporated into that technology. But
does the technology itself have a moral compass, or is it that religion, culture, philosophy, however it comes to be, and I think it's a combination of all of them, can anchor you, right? And again, I don't have a perfect answer for this. I do think, I mean, this is one of the things I pointed out at the end of the book, the 1867 Project. There's 20 authors, I'm just one, but at the end of the book, my chapter is on ideas and the need to unite around laudable ideas, right? The worth of the individual, treatment of the individual as equal in law and policy, not dividing people by identity, ethnicity, which we're again, some people are again doing these days in law and policy, which I think is a disaster. That's most of human history. People being tribal, according rights to the group and not the individual, disastrous. So I think we do need to unite around good ideas, the worth of the individual, private property, freedom to express yourself, to free expression to debate, free inquiry. So capitalism, I would argue, open markets, that sort of thing. We need to unite around, good ideas, laudable ideas in Canada, precisely because there's so many identities, right? We've got people from all over the world, and I think that's a good thing. But we need to remind ourselves, what's the core of being Canadian? What do we cherish? As opposed to saying every idea is equal. Well, no, they're not. I don't want polygamy legal in Canada because it's injurious to women. So I think we just need to talk about these things and be honest about some of these things and unite around the best ideas and discard the rest. Whether the ideas came from the colonial era and the British, which many of them did, these liberal ideas, which might today be called small c conservative, but whatever the label, these are great ideas from John Stuart Mill, from Mary Wollstonecraft on the rights of women, Edmund Burke on private property, and so on and so forth. So
you see, you mentioned multiculturalism, yes, with the rise in immigration, with the fact that we're no longer just a British or French colony. We are an evolving society, and we have evolving social norms. Are our institutions ready for some of the tensions that you're bound to see when you bring multiple cultures together, which is relatively recent in Canada? Are our institutions too slow or moving too fast?
I don't know if it's an institutional response as much as again, sort of cultural beliefs, the ideas in our heads expressed in the media, expressed through politicians. When Justin Trudeau 8 years ago said, there's no core identity, Canada, he couldn't have been more wrong. There is a core identity. There's always been a core identity. In fact, he went on to enunciate some of it. We're this, we're that, the other thing, tolerant and the rest of it. And which means he assumes we should and do have some core ideas. I don't know it's an institutional response. It's a question of, again, can we unite around laudable ideas? And I think, not being Pollyannish, I think there's the possibility for that, for sure. If you look at the example of Hong Kong, I was there 10 years ago on a fact-finding mission for a think tank. I met politicians and journalists and business people. Almost to a person, they said, there's three things we want. We want the rule of law, including the British legal code, retained, capitalism, and the anti-corruption efforts, which they had developed in the 1970s. And this was vis-a-vis Beijing, because Beijing and the courts in China were corrupt. They didn't practice really free enterprise capitalism. It's crony capitalism in China proper. And so they value these things, and they valued the British legal, the rule of law. So, most of Hong Kong, they don't come from Great Britain. They're not Europeans either in ancestry, right? And they didn't come from the British Isles, obviously. But they value these things because these are good ideas and they allow people to be free and flourish. So I think Canada should follow the Hong Kong model before Beijing messed it up, of attaching oneself to good ideas. And in fact, in the protests against the recent, repression from Beijing over the past year, past 10 years, what you've seen even is people raise the British flag and say, we value our British colonial heritage. Imagine that protest in Canada vis-a-vis, current federal governments or talking heads. We value the colonial heritage for the capitalism, for private property, for the rule of law, for the anti-corruption efforts. I'd like to see that kind of protest. So ideas are not based on skin. They can be good ideas or bad ideas, but they're not based on skin color, ethnicity. They do sometimes come from certain cultural understandings, but fundamentally ideas can be shared, which is positive. So I don't know that's institutional response. I do think politicians and others are being pretty sloppy about not defending those good ideas. Instead they pretend every idea from every culture at every point in history is equal. No, it's not. Bride burning in India was a bad idea, and the British tried to abolish it and did. Self-representation in India from Mahatma Gandhi was also a good idea. Nobody wants to be ruled forever by someone across the sea. So,
you've expressed some core values on which good ideas emerge and bad ideas would be contrary. we are living in a period, some have defined it as a period of good ideas or ideas called postmodernism, which seems to me to be more about feelings than it is about reason. How do you counter, or how do you rationalize the relevance of postmodernism at this time, which seems to be taking us into a whole new realm where it isn't reason that's relevant, it's what your feelings are. And you can have feelings that are different from mine, and we got to live with that. Okay, that's tolerance. But at some point in time, violence seems to emerge in order to reinforce these new principles. And I think that's going too far.
Well, when feelings replace facts as the basis for a discussion, we've got a problem. If we believe in the possibility of objective facts, we can at least argue whether you got it right or not, right? Again, back to the analogy of building a skyscraper in New York 100 years ago. If you get it right, you build the Chrysler Building or the Empire State Building. You've obviously done your fact checking correctly on the water and the soil, and whether your building can last. But when feelings replace facts, then you're in la la land, and we are in that today with a lot of things. I don't know, I'm not an expert in postmodernism, but the first chapter in the 1867 project, the case for cherishing Canada, not canceling it, right? The book that we've got at the Aristotle Foundation and just released, which you can buy on Amazon, by the way. In that book, the first chapter is from Bruce Pardy, professor of law at Queen's University. And Bruce does a masterful job of going through what he calls 4 doctrines of the apocalypse. But basically, critical theory is at the heart of all 4, and there's spin-offs. I think critical race theory is one, postmodernism is another, and there's a 4th. And Bruce, in this chapter in the 1867 project, does a masterful job of saying, here's why they're flawed. But he starts with critical theory, and critical theory it came from, basically, it's rewarmed Marxism, and Marxism's kind of underlying belief was that the only reality is that determined by power. And what that means is, it doesn't matter if, people, and this was the problem with Marxism. It actually believed, a Marxist believed, that you could impose kind of a communist system where everybody had to be equal, even though people aren't equal in their efforts, desires, choices. Some people want to be doctors, some people want to be dentists, some people want to be laborers, some people want to work 4 hours, some people work 40 hours. And what Marxism, the mistake of Marxism was to think, capitalism was just an imposed system. No, people have been trading like fish and grain since ancient Mesopotamia. Business has always been there. Trade has always been there. They were dead wrong. But Marxism believed that you could create anything from the top down. What postmodernism or critical theory is about is now extending that to the entire kind of, not only just the economy, but social issues, cultural issues. And so that anything is just a construct. And if we have power, we can kind of refashion human beings. Stalin believed the same thing about Ukrainians, right? He could just take away their farms and you'd still get the kind of the same grain next year as you did last. No, you can't. And so critical theory is really enamored. Its explanation is that everything is due to power. That doesn't explain much, actually. It doesn't explain why someone throws himself in a grenade in the middle of a war to save their buddy. It doesn't explain the love of a mother for her child. And so critical theory is actually pretty poor as an explanation for anything. But it says, everything's about power, which is how they justify, for example, critical theory does reverse racism today, where if you're the wrong skin color, the wrong ethnicity, you can be discriminated against in a job because they say, well, your group oppressed people 100 years ago, therefore we're going to try and balance things out. Again, it's all top down as opposed to, no, let's value merit and character and opportunity. Let's, have government programs for people that are poor, not based on skin color, because then you can potentially correct, things for everyone, regardless of who they are. So critical theory, long answer to short question, critical theory and postmodernism are dangerous because frankly, they're a denial of reality.
Excellent. I'm going to turn now to your book, which I found fascinating. Not because of the last chapter, but because the building, the layer and the layering of chapter after chapter after chapter of giving some in-depth thought to some of the issues that we're facing today, and often, in almost every chapter, revealing something about the origins of these issues and how we have wrongly portrayed what we're going. Everybody today is a victim, and the role the government seems to be playing is, we're here to help you, almost from you're top down. We're going to develop a program for victims, and we are all victims. And sooner or later, I mean, what do we all give up and decide we're now enslaved because government is the only vehicle out there that exists that is now going to save us all, whether you're tall, short, merit's gone, I'm just a victim, take care of me. And I saw that in the recent election in Alberta. One side saying we need more government, the other side saying we have less. One saying individuals should accept the fact that there are responsibilities in our society, and the other side saying, no, government will take care of you. I think we've gotten ourselves into a bit of a trap here, a dichotomy. It's either one way or the other. Your book came forth with some answers, and the foundation was one of the byproducts of it. Why the foundation, and what is it you think you can do with your foundation?
Well, yeah, and in fact, I think you might be referencing, maybe unconsciously, a recent book, even before the one we just released, the 1867 Project. So behind me on the shelves, you'll see the victim cult. So there was a lot in the victim cult that I wrote on this issue where, we've got a movement of victims now. Sometimes people are victims, but when you get stuck there, it's really dangerous because it takes away the belief that you can do anything about your situation. But in the most recent book, in essence, I suppose it could be a bit of a follow-up, but I and 19 other authors, and they come from all across Canada, and also one fellow from India who said, why do you Canadians pick on yourselves, or destroy what you built? An entrepreneur from Goa, India, a wonderful chapter from Gaurav Jaswal in that part of the book. The 1867 Project, Why Canada Should Be Cherished, Not Canceled, delves into some of these recent attacks on Canada, which are basically an attack on, I would say, self-responsibility and responsible government, right? And it portrays everyone as a victim in the sense that it looks at history as, and those in history as either only oppressors or oppressed. That's actually a pretty shallow, inaccurate view of history. And let me give you a clear example. We've got a chapter in John A. Macdonald from a Toronto lawyer who's also a member of the Métis Nation of Ontario. And he brings out some nuance in John A. Macdonald, which has been lacking recently. So in the 1867 Project, Greg P. Atsky from Toronto writes this chapter, and it writes of how Macdonald, for example, and other early, Canadian founders insisted that treaties be signed in the Canadian West before most settlement occurred, precisely because they didn't want to repeat of the United States. They established the Northwest Mounted Police, now the RCMP, precisely to protect early settlers, people we now call Indigenous, from later settlers. They believed in the rule of law. And John A. Macdonald provided famine relief through Parliament, argued against the Liberals of the day who wanted to cut it back. And he said, no, we need to provide famine relief. Some people argue it wasn't enough, but Greg argues in his chapter that John A. Macdonald, because of his actions, saved thousands of lives. But we live in a time where people look at John A. Macdonald, and because he doesn't have exactly the same views we would today, or said some things that you can interpret pretty meanly is the best way to put it, that he should be canceled, that we shouldn't have any sort of admiration for his accomplishments, and the same with other early founders. That's actually unfortunate. And the other flip side to this is, let's talk about the British. There's another chapter in the 1867 Project by Chris Champion. And he basically says, look at the British Empire around the world at its heyday. Of course, it had its flaws, but it also had its virtues. The British Empire is the one that tried to wipe out and did wipe out slavery almost worldwide, including in Canada, one of the first countries to wipe out slavery, to abolish slavery. Now, where does slavery still exist in Canada? Into the late 19th century. I hate to say it, but among some First Nations in British Columbia. And Governor James Douglas, the mid-century governor before British Columbia was even a province, had to negotiate, cajole, sometimes bought slaves from Indigenous settlements to free them. This was, and my point here is what? That there's no, perfectly good guys in human history just because they belong to one's own ethnic enclave or look just like oneself. Whether it's Indigenous folks or the British or Canada's founders or someone today, we're all a mixture of good and bad. Or as the famous Soviet dissident said, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, when he was in camps in gulags in the Soviet Union, he saw people that said, if only we can eliminate that person over there, we will have a good society. And Solzhenitsyn figured out pretty quickly that no, the problem is in the human heart. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn captured it perfectly when he wrote that the dividing line between good and evil runs through every human heart. What he meant by that is we're all subject to the temptations. And if you look of good and evil, and if you look back in history to your own family tree, your own ancestral tree, your own ethnic, history, whatever it is, you will find plenty of evil and hopefully some good. And it's a mistake to romanticize one's own tribe, so to speak, one's own ancestral families. One of the chapters I was going to write in the first book, The Victim Cult, the one that came out a couple of years ago, I was going to entitle it All Our Ancestors Are Bastards. I gave it a slightly different title. But whether that book or the 1867 project, now, what's important to understand is there's a lot more nuance in history. And we ought to respect, actually, that, again, late 19th century, a very rural country, you had John A. Macdonald, you had others who believed that the individual was worth something. And they were trying to protect the individual and promote the individual vis-a-vis the collectives, including vis-a-vis some, again, First Nations, but First Nations as well were partners in building this country. And in fact, I try and point this out. The way to look at Canada is not as like some failed experiment, it's anything but. Starting 20,000 years ago, when the first people we now call Indigenous crossed the Bering Strait, they had a heck of a job crossing, was basically an ice flow, or an ice-strewn Canada, building what later became, what we know as Canada now, or 500 years ago, the French fur traders, and so on and so forth, or someone that came from Ukraine 2 months ago. We've all helped build Canada. So the question is, has it been a perfect project? No. By definition, projects are imperfect and human beings are imperfect, but we're building, and we have built a pretty decent country compared to most of human history. We might want to acknowledge that, cherish that, instead of tear it down. That's, I think, the core message of all the authors in the 1867 project book.
Okay, so I would love to be able to say to my grandson and for the students in his class to say you should be proud of Canada. We should spend time helping you understand the foundations of why we feel that way. But it seems to me that facts among some are irrelevant because the end justifies the means. If I want to fix things, I don't want to hear facts. I want you to feel guilt. I want you to feel that I care more about that issue than you do. And I don't care about the facts. All I care about is getting the results of fixing a problem. I think we've got it. I think we've gone overboard in this belief that somehow this utopia of equity is going to somehow take us into this new world where love one another I loved the 70s. I had long hair. I had a beard. I had my beads. I did a little smoking, but that wasn't the answer. Love one another just didn't seem to resonate overall to change the way human beings were going to be treating one another.
But to your point, there's a number of things that I think need to happen. For one, we need to sort of step back, which is what we're going to do at the foundation, and actually what we've done in the book, the 1867 project, by asking the question. So you hear the accusation these days, and you've alluded to it. We need to fix something. When people say we're an institutionally racist society, we're a systemically racist society. Well, I question that. And the reason I question that is because I know my history. And if you go back to the 1950s, actually, Ontario was one of the first provinces to outlaw discrimination based on race, based on gender. So, for example, in 1951, 1952, they passed legislation against discrimination in hiring and accommodation based on skin color. You could no longer do that. That was institutional discrimination, and it was outlawed in Ontario. I don't know the exact date in every other province, but that started 70 years ago. And for people to say we're institutionally or systemically racist today, it's like, do you know your history? Do you know that 100 years ago, white San Franciscans would discriminate against those of Chinese origin in that city and wouldn't allow them into their hospitals? That was systemic or institutional discrimination. The institution literally discriminated. Or when universities in Canada wouldn't allow Jews in until, or at least in great numbers. That was institutional discrimination. Now, but that has been dealt with. Now, there's personal prejudice, but people today, I think, conflate personal prejudice, the occasional bigot you will meet out there, with institutional discrimination, and they're not the same thing. So the first thing is to question the claim that we have a problem to solve. What problem are you solving? So that's the first question to ask. And in the 1867 project, Matthew Lau, a financial analyst out of Toronto, has written a wonderful chapter on this question in the book on, are we institutionally racist? And Matthew's answer, to cut to the chase, is no. He looks at, for example, income and ethnicities these days. And if you know if you know your income charts, just Canada, you will know that those of East Asian origin are at the top. People with pale faces like me are in the middle. And, on average, Black Canadians and Indigenous Canadians have lower average incomes than everybody else. Now, sometimes there's reasons for that, which have to be explored. Why do Indigenous Canadians, on average, have lower incomes? Well, because a greater proportion are in rural areas. They have lower educational levels on average, and they're also younger. And when you're younger, you don't make as much as when you're older. And the reverse is true of, say, Taiwanese Canadians, right? Average age is older, high education levels in the cities, all of that. So these things matter. So first of all, you got to question what people claim is just true. This is common knowledge. We're a racist society. Now, you can find a few bigots, but we're not a systemically racist society. It would be Matthew Lau's argument. So I think that's number one. And that's one of the things we want to do at Aristotle and Will is say, are you sure what you think is a fact is factual? Or are you misinterpreting the data? You might be doing the latter. So that's one of the things we're going to do here. And then, and you can use history and statistics to try and like tease out again what may be happening there. We're going to take a very empirical approach, by the way. That's one of the things we want to do. Yeah.
Message out.
Sorry?
I mean, to the extent that you've got something to say, and it's important and it's timely, and people need to hear it. But how do you get the message out?
Well, you treat good ideas and facts and informed history like Coke. So you market Coke, and that's what we're going to do. Even if you even look at, we've got some videos on our website, and I can try and share my screen if you want me to bring that up now, Perry. Shall we try that?
Yes.
And let's take a look. So this is the book cover, the 1867 Project, Why Canada Should Be Cherished, Not Canceled. But our new website, which literally we launched 2 days ago.
Chapters in it. Every chapter is worth a read.
Thank you. This is the new website, aristotlefoundation.org. And you'll see we want to market the chapters and the videos. So we've got a 2-minute video here from Rima Azar. Rima comes from Lebanon originally. She moved here 30 years ago when she was 17. And she knows the dangers of identity politics. So she talks about the dangers of dividing people based on race or ethnicity, or in the case of Lebanon, religion. And so we're going to market our product, so to speak, the book, future research, future studies, columns. We've got Matthew Lau, who I just mentioned a moment ago, talking about the data, right? Here's the average weekly earnings of Canadian men. Guys like you and me are on the middle in weekly earnings. If your ethnic heritage or, family history is leads back to Japan, whether 150 years ago or 50 years ago, you're at the top of the income heap, so to speak. And again, there's reasons for that. The average Japanese person in Canada is, say, older than someone who might be Filipino. And so there's differences in the data. But what we're going to try and do, Perry, is we're going to try and make our information as accessible as possible at the Aristotle Foundation. And but that's kind of my answer. I mean, I think we live in a propagandist age and an anti-reality age. I don't think people are getting nourished. And
let me bring you back to influence and having the capacity to educate, having the capacity to handle arguments with leaders that are off base.
Yeah.
There's a politic to this. A little bit about who's behind this. You're obviously articulate. You've got exceptional background. If you played the role in bringing those 20 people together, good on you. But it's got to be more than you. Who is on your board?
Sure. Oh, for sure. But let me explain again, I think, the theory of change, right? So people believe certain things, and that's kind of your culture. And then they percolate out there, and eventually they get taken up by political partisan politicians and that. So really, it's about a battle of ideas and making sure ideas and policies are anchored in reality. But here's kind of my theory of change as well, in the sense, when people are propagandized, or when all you do is eat cotton candy all your life, or that's what you're fed. When you're on vacation, it's like when you're on vacation. It's 4 p.m. in the afternoon. You're in a strange city. You may not know where the restaurants are. You may not even think you're hungry yet. It's 4 p.m. But you walk down a street, you walk by a restaurant, you smell something. You're like, I want that, right? Maybe it's fish or steak or something. And you think, okay, that's what I want for dinner, because you didn't know you were hungry until you smelt it. It's the same thing with ideas anchored in reality. If people say, everything's due to racism, And people say, what about geography? What about education? What about your parental upbringing? What about if you had a library card as a kid, as the American economist Thomas Sowell has observed? Well, when you encounter good ideas or ideas anchored in reality, they're kind of their own persuasive, they have their own persuasive nature. But at the Aristotle Foundation, so what we've done is we've set up in the past year, we just received our charitable number. We literally launched the new website 2 days ago. We've got the new book out, the 1867 Project. We're also going to work with, I would say, informed people. They don't all have to be academics, but people have some expertise in a field and can, talk about data and statistics, or bring in history to talk about the history of Canada, like this Toronto lawyer did on John A. Macdonald. We're going to bring in like Jamil Javani, who's from Toronto. He's a lawyer, went to Yale, I believe. He's written a great chapter on Black Canadians and why it's a mistake to look at Black Canadians as one single cohort and think they should all have X view as opposed to diverse views like anyone else. That's kind of a form of reverse racism when you think all Black Canadians should think alike. And he's offended by that as kind of a libertarian / conservative. So there's a number of people involved in the Aristotle Foundation. We now have 30 senior fellows, from across the country that'll be writing on history, on some of these issues we've just talked about. We're going to explore urban issues, right? The breakdown of some social norms in the cities. Like, I think it's terrible that a young mother has to worry about going to a local park and finding needles. How did this happen? How do we change this, right? So we're going to have a number of people roll out some good ideas over the next month, 3 months, 10 months, 10 years. And I think what you'll see is we're going to address real modern issues, from cancel culture to identity politics, to some of the breakdown we're seeing in our urban centers, which is really unfortunate because cities is where most of us live, or the problems in some of the problems in some of the criminal justice, in the criminal justice system, revolving doors. So some things like that. We're pretty ambitious. We won't get to everything right away, but our goal is to start the conversation. It's a cliche, but start people thinking. I mean, if you wanted a slogan about the Aristotle Foundation, like our logo is championing reason, democracy, and civilization. But I can give you another idea of how to think about the Aristotle Foundation. We're going to make you think.
Are you afraid of becoming politicized, that all of a sudden the media or the politicians step up and say, oh, another right-wing think tank, irrelevant, now that they painted you into a corner, and you never get listened to because people automatically apply a set of principles which aren't thinking principles, they're political principles. Are you afraid of that?
Well, I'm sure people will try that, I guess, but reality is not, one partisan. It's not one partisan hue. And look, I mean, ultimately, again, you want to ask the question, as Aristotle did. One of the reasons I named it after him is because, people have been thinking about this since his time and before, is what does the good life look like? What kind of society do we want? Those are not fundamentally partisan questions. They become that. And they're not relegated to one particular political party because, every political party and politician has the temptation to say 2 + 2 = 5 if they think it'll get votes. And if the public believes at some point 2 + 2 = 5, right? If they believe in anti-reality remedies to problems. So no, but I think the way to counter that is just to do good work. And over time, people will recognize that. Let me give you an example from a past job that I had. When I was research director with a small think tank out of Winnipeg, I commissioned a study once on an immigrant cohort, and the problems we were seeing with immigrant, directed towards immigrant women on honor killing. I saw a post, a National Post column by a Toronto social worker, and it was about the problem of honor in some of the Southeast Asian communities, where there was a heavy emphasis on basically telling the women and the daughters and the sisters that they had to obey the men in their lives at the risk of violence or death. And there were several honor killings that had occurred around this time. And Aruna Papp was the author. I hired Aruna to write a study on honor killings. And this was in 2010. And she just talked about what she'd seen as a social worker. And she herself had emigrated from India some years earlier, 20 years earlier. And she talked about this problem of honor, an extreme version of honor in some of these communities. And at this point, no one would talk about this, right? It was thought, you touch this, you'll blow your leg off, so to speak. Well, this study was published. and it went viral. I've never seen anything like it. Rona Ambrose, then the Minister for the Status of Women, took it up and championed it. Aruna got interview after interview after interview. I got a call from the Toronto Star from Carol Gore, a columnist, who said, Mark, why would a right-wing think tank that I was at the time publish a study on immigrant women? And I said, because this is a new issue of freedom. Like, we don't have slavery anymore, but these immigrant women, some of them are held captive, so to speak, by some of their own family. And there's a lot of gray in some of this as well. Like, but anyway, I mean, the violence is certainly not gray, and the murders weren't. And so this needed to be addressed openly. And there wasn't really a public policy solution, but it was the first step towards saying, again, is this the kind of Canada we want, where some father or brother can control the woman in their life to such an extent that if they don't obey them, they'll be murdered? This is, was and is dangerous thinking. So the fact that we were able to talk about it openly cracked it open. And Aruna did a wonderful job. And this thing went viral. It went on for 6 months. I mean, interview after interview, and it changed her life. And she wrote a book about her own experience. So again, sorry, Perry, long answer to short question. It was, I think you just have to do good, honest work, and eventually people will recognize it. We'll get critics early on. But you know something, again, the truth has its own power. When you walk by a restaurant at 4 p.m. in the afternoon and your stomach tells you you're hungry for something substantial, I think life is like that. When you offer something substantial, eventually most people recognize that you're offering a good product, so to speak, and you're offering something honest and good.
Almost an endorsement of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The relevance of the golden rule, the importance of reason and rational and sharing thoughts, the importance of ideas and sharing of ideas.
What an incredibly informative presentation.
Thank you.
And kudos to you for doing the multidisciplinary, that historical aspect. And your reference to the slavery in Ontario reminds me about, what's the university that they just canceled? Oh, Perry's there. Yeah. Perry will know the name of the university that they just changed the name to.
Oh, yeah. In fact, we've got a chapter on that. Yeah, in the book, in the 1867 project. From a Toronto author, former New Democrat member of Parliament, Lynn McDonald, and she writes on the cancellation of Ryerson, right?
Ryerson. Yeah.
And she thinks it's atrocious. I mean, here was a fellow who started public education in Canada and was a maker of Canada, which used to be a famous series, I guess, in the early 1900s. So Lynn McDonald's chapter in the 1867 project is absolutely wonderful, because she talks about Ryerson's accomplishments and achievements and says you're blaming residential schools in Egerton Ryerson, where he started the public school system, and compulsory attendance at residential schools, whether they think that was good or bad, occurred 50 years after Ryerson died. And in fact, he had a deep and abiding friendship with the Ojibwe, and was not, I don't know if he was an honorary part of that First Nation, but was certainly had deep friendships there and knew the language. So again, there's a simplistic approach to history where some problem today is blamed on something that happened 100 years ago, and it may not be an accurate diagnosis, and it's often not an accurate representation of the choices available at the time or the accomplishments, or in Egerton's case.
I think your two metaphors were just spot on, the oak tree and those smells when you're on vacation. So
I'm going to look for hands now, Mark, and I'll do a sum up as we get to the end with the traditional thank yous and whatever. But Randall, you had some comments there. And
I mean, it comes down to something I've been wrestling with for a while. I mean, I have a lot of friends on the progressive side of the equation, and they're all against hate speech. And yet me, coming from a point of view of philosophy of science and sociology of knowledge, I see that free and open speech is absolutely essential to any kind of progress. Ideas need to compete. It's like an evolutionary process, and the wider adopted ideas tend to take root and grow and so on. But again, going to my philosophy roots, we know about slippery slope arguments. Once you start saying hate speech is not allowed and it's against the law, then it raises other questions of like who decides what is hate speech?
Yeah.
And it becomes also, I guess another way of putting it is a scope creep. You can start extrapolating from those arguments to other things beyond what we would normally intuitively call hate, just because it's good for society. So how do you address this question? I mean, to me, it comes down to some very fine logic, which Aristotle would have loved to, dialogue on.
Well, so off the top of my head, I mean, I think there are several things there. Let's start with the fundamental problem, though. You mentioned progressives, and fundamentally, I think the question is not whether one is progressive or right wing or conservative or libertarian or woke. I mean, we all use some of that language, and sometimes it's applicable, sometimes it's not. The fundamental question should be: is this policy idea in touch with reality? And that's not the purview of any particular ideology or belief or, point on the political spectrum or political party. Anyone can be anti-reality. Look, Donald Trump is famously anti-reality. He claimed, I don't know if he thinks this in his heart, he claimed he lost the 2020 election. No, you didn't, Donald. You lost fair and square. And he was told by everyone around him, including his attorney general, Bill Barr. And there's a whole list of people that told him that. So he was anti-reality. So this isn't something that's necessarily exclusive of, one ideology or leaning or political party. So the question is, are we in touch with reality? Free speech is, to that point, is necessary to say, are you in touch with reality? If you propose an idea, then, you want to be able to question someone. This is the basic scientific approach, right? And free expression has allowed for the growth or for a more flourishing society, right? What if women didn't have the right to express themselves in the late 1800s, early 1900s? How would the suffragist movement have started? What if people didn't have the right to object to eugenics, right? So free expression is at the core, actually, of useful reforms. Of course, it can be abused. John Stuart Mill.
And we do have courts. We do have courts. Institution to try.
Well, yeah, and if you defame somebody, but I have a problem with hate speech as well, because it's not just a slippery slope. It's fundamentally anti-knowledge, and in fact, how you deal with bad ideas or really evil ideas or hate even is you expose it. That's what free expression does. If you have hate speech laws, what you actually do, like Holocaust denial, for example, I think the government wants to or already has criminalized Holocaust denial. The Holocaust happened. But if you drive Holocaust denial underground, then guess what? You make people think they're victims or that you're outlining it for some nefarious reason. I want Holocaust deniers to be in the open, because then you can discredit them, right? If you drive it underground, then you don't have the conversations about why you're wrong about denying the Holocaust. So
it's an extremely important point. If you drive things underground, you really haven't changed them. In fact, you may be festering even more of a ultimate protest. So it also plays into the distinction between entertainment and education. I mean, you've got Fox News, which is probably more about entertainment than it is about facts. So you can tolerate it if it's acknowledged as entertainment. I'm not so sure you can tolerate it if in fact it's viewed as an educational, factual source. So
we've been discussing hate speech and a culture that gets their attitudes from memes. They're 4 words in a picture. How do we get them to find and make the time to dive into things like Ryerson's history, McDonald's past, and how he wasn't the demon that they've painted him as, and throwing red paint and pulling down his statues, where those truths come into reality? How do we help people move beyond the pretty little meme that will send hundreds of thousands of evil messages? Well, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say evil, messages that are poorly founded on very minimal facts, if any. How do we deal with that? And that's where I'm appreciating the concepts that you've discussed, is that they're looking underneath the thin veneer that has been painted on top of them.
It's a good question. And again, I think part of it is just telling the truth and just finding a way to get it into people's hands, right? Which can be a challenge sometimes. It's less of a challenge than it used to be. I mean, pre-internet, the major publications and major television stations pretty much had a quasi-monopoly, just the way it was, right? Technology didn't exist that you could share stuff like we do now on the internet. But that era wasn't perfect. Our imperfect era is a lot of junk on the internet too. Again, free expression is not a cure-all, but free expression at least allows you to question some of the stuff you see, and there's no perfect, Perry mentioned Fox News. There's some stuff on there. I hardly watch any TV anymore, but I'm aware of the controversy surrounding Fox, but any channel. But there's no perfect, organ out there, media, organ out there. The New York Times in the 1930s was in denial about the Holocaust and, sort of the Holodomor in Ukraine, the famine in Ukraine, the Stalin-directed, collectivization, which caused the famine in Ukraine. And yet the New York Times had a reporter saying everything's fine over here. Right? Walter Duranty, I believe it was. And so even a prominent newspaper like the New York Times got it wrong. And sometimes they often do. Traditional media does too. So there's no perfect answer here. I think free expression is not, a perfect remedy. It's not meant to be a perfect remedy. What free expression is like the scientific method. It allows you to investigate something. That's why, again, damaging free expression and free inquiry is so counterproductive. You can't improve on something if you can't say there's a problem. Let me give you a clear example from Canada. We hear these days that the problems, say the below average income, say, of Indigenous Canadians would be due to past or present racism. Maybe there are some other explanations here as well. As I mentioned a moment ago, and I did this in my last book, The Victim Cult. But alluded to it in the 1867 project, along with the other 19 authors. There are other explanations sometimes when you see differences in average outcomes between groups. So with Indigenous Canadians, as I mentioned a moment ago, there's a greater proportion that live in rural areas, reserves, right? That's going to bring your incomes down because you're far away from income and opportunity. I grew up near the West Bank First Nation, very profitable or, prosperous First Nation, but they're in the Sun Belt. If you're northern Manitoba, your choices are limited. So there's other explanations for these disparities. And the point of saying that, or having free expression, is to say, maybe the explanation that everything's due to something that happened in the past isn't actually the best explanation for an outcome now. Maybe, again, and it's positive, actually, it's fundamentally positive, what will help raise all First Nations incomes is more education, moving closer to the cities, the opportunities. That's very fundamentally, and it's changeable. That's the thing about it. One doesn't have to stay in northern Manitoba in the middle of nowhere, whether you're Indigenous or someone else. You can move to the cities. And so that's fundamentally positive. But if you don't have free expression, or if everybody's fixated on this is the only explanation. Thomas Sowell, the American economist, who's like 93 now, but he's written on race and culture for about 50 years. And he's brilliant on the stuff. And he's analyzed this in the American context. He's a Black American, grew up in the South and in Harlem. And people for years have said, again, the differences between Black Americans and everyone else, any differences in average outcomes and incomes is due solely to racism. Abraham Kendi peddles this today. Thomas Sowell's response is, no. When you actually compare apple to apple, say, two university educated people in a marriage, the husband and wife, Black or white, they were equalized out by the 1980s, where he talks about a great example of the mistake of again, blaming everything on one factor. He says in one of his books, he talks about how Italians historically dominated the fishing industry worldwide, not the Swiss. Why would that be? Is that because of prejudice against the Swiss around the world in favor of the Italians? No. The reason should be obvious. Geography. The Italians have coastlines. The Swiss have none. Of course, the Italians would develop an advantage in fishing. And he says, look at your own family. You have brothers and sisters, perhaps. Do you all have equal outcomes? You were raised in the same family, same environment. You still had different outcomes. You might be richer or poorer than your sibling. You might have an interest in art and they have an interest in mechanics, whatever it is. We're not the same. That leads to different outcomes. So I don't know if I answered the question. I think part of this, again, is just trying really hard to say, sole cause explanations are usually faulty. Let's look at a multiplicity of factors. And that enriches our understanding of each other and the human experience and what it takes to succeed. So again, the danger of clamping down on free expression or calling everything hate is you're not going to get to explanations that may be a better explanation for an observed effect.
So moving from hate and the relevance of free expression and its importance, and not to close it down, but to allow ideas to emerge and for our social mores to evolve, let's shift gears to the concept of merit, which seems to be secondary to addressing social issues. Where do you stand on the relevance of merit?
Yeah. Well, there's no perfect way to measure, I guess, right? Is there? I mean, this is the knock against, talking about merit. People say, well, how do you measure this perfectly? And to be fair, there, you can't measure merit perfectly. I mean, you can have 10 candidates in front of you and, they might all have, varying grades and, you still don't know which one will perform better at the office, right? Someone with a lesser grade might perform better than someone else. So merit and qualifications can, can only tell you so much. So you still do a bit of a gut check when you hire, for example. I think the key thing that should be emphasized is opportunity. So, for example, one of the reasons I oppose what some call affirmative action in the United States, equity policies here in Canada, which I call by the more, I think, accurate name, racial and gender quotas. The reason I'm opposed to that is not because I don't want diversity in the workforce or anywhere else. The reason I'm opposed to that is because I don't want the grandson of Bill Cosby, so to speak, if this is an American context, to get a job or a grant from the government because of skin color, when some poor guy from Arkansas who, looks like me, doesn't get it and grew up in a poor family. Like, that's nuts. You're instead of looking at people as individuals again, you're categorizing people by groups, by ethnicity, potentially, by everything else that matters. So how do you deal with that then? How do you help people? Why don't we look at people as we should, based as individuals, and say based on poverty? So if you came from a poor background, I mean, I got a student loan. My parents weren't rich. They lost everything in the 1980s. I didn't come from privilege. And so I got a student loan when I went to university. I'm thankful that other taxpayers provided that for me. It allowed me to get a university education because I was so scared of incurring debt. I would have worked for probably 10 years to try and pay for my university tuition for the first year if I didn't have a student loan. I mean, so look, I appreciate the opportunities. So what I'm saying is I think we need to look at, can we help someone, because they're in a, bad situation, because they're poor, and not look at skin color, ethnicity, the rest of it. And I think that's where the focus should be. How can we provide opportunity as opposed to trying to equalize outcomes? Again, you can't equalize outcomes. I mean, if you're a Taiwanese Canadian, or Taiwanese Canadians are at the top of the heap, and the same thing with, with American data. If you're from East Asia or your ancestry is East Asian, you're at the top of the income heap because you probably got an education or you're entrepreneurial or both. It's baked into you, both of those things for various cultural reasons. And some communities are behind on that. Hispanic Americans, same thing in Canada, are at the bottom of the income heap. And again, there's various factors that go into that, but one of them is education. So maybe emphasize education, or these days, the trades, right? The trades make a lot of money. We should be emphasizing the trades and not just a university degree, especially because some of the rot that's in universities. So, let's emphasize opportunity for the individual. Again, there's no perfect remedy, but I think that's the key, is to focus on what can be done regardless of, the unchangeable characteristics. Because again, I mentioned earlier, one of the authors in the 1867 project is Rima Azar. And I saw this also in The Victim Cult, where I analyzed this grievance narrative. It becomes very dangerous when we divide people only into victims or only into oppressors. And it again misses, because we saw this in Rwanda. The Germans thought this in the 1800s. Long before they got to race purity, the Germans were enamored with their own victim status. And the truth is, they were victims of the French, who had conquered them in the late 18th century. But the Germans were possessed by this vision of a victimhood, and it was dangerous, and it went viral. And when they glommed onto race, the race theories, unscientific, pseudoscientific race theories, we saw what happened in the 20th century. But the Germans always thought of themselves as victims, and that ended badly for them and everyone else. So again, I think it's important to emphasize opportunity and shared humanity, what we have in common, not just what divides us, and especially not unchangeable characteristics, because those will never change by definition.
So programs that are addressing opportunity, not simply supplementing. Dale,
are based in unchangeable characteristics. I'm just fundamentally opposed to that. I think it's fundamentally unfair to judge people or give a grant out or an award based on unchangeable characteristics, because you can't change those.
Excellent. Dale, you have a comment or a question?
Just wonderful, Mike. I'm really enjoying it, and obviously want to get involved in that. I put a couple questions or just comments in the chat. I think one of the more interesting ones, you talked about victimhood. We could talk a little bit about that. But immigration and indigenous, it's an interesting situation where we now are looking at resettling people and communicating with people that don't have the same ability to process narratives, especially English narrative. And I'm wondering, have you guys had any investigation or insight into informatics as a way of transcending the language barriers?
Thank you, Dale. Go ahead.
No, I don't know anything about informatics, but in the last two chapters of the 1867 project, a friend of mine, Van Vikachalam, who immigrated from India 20 years ago, him and I, in that chapter, look at immigration data. And of course, the numbers are soaring. And look, I'm fundamentally pro-immigration, pro-immigrant. But we've also found that for the most part, actually, if you look at the data, immigrants are integrating. Like if you look at their labor participation rates, it's pretty high in Canada. The unemployment rates are pretty low compared to, say, native-born Canadians. And this is unlike some countries like the United States or France, actually, that have much lower participation rates and higher unemployment rates for immigrants. So actually, Canada is mostly doing something right when it comes to immigrants. That doesn't mean, but to me, what that signals, though, is also with high immigration rates, we want to make sure we unite around laudable ideas and not divide based on, the rhetoric from some politicians who, want to say that, any analysis of good ideas versus bad ideas, or if you question any cultural precept, that somehow you're a racist. No. What's the famous Somalian emigre to Holland and then to the United States, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who was born and raised a devout fundamentalist Muslim and has since become an atheist. She disagrees with Islam. I think she's got every right to do that as an atheist. You need those sorts of conversations. And not every idea is created equal, right? Female genital mutilation should never be a core Canadian possibility or value. So this to me is common sense. But I guess in some circles, to talk about that openly these days is considered hate speech. It's not. It's about what's a good idea, what contributes to human freedom and flourishing, and what's not. Long answer to short question again. But, I think, again, lots of immigrants actually appreciate Canada more than some native-born Canadians do. They came here for opportunity. One of the chapters in the book is from an immigrant saying, don't destroy the opportunity that we found in Canada.
Well put. Very well put. Dawn, you've got your hand up. You have a question?
Yes, I do. First of all, great presentation, Mark.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it very much.
Thanks, Dawn.
And I've got a question for you, given the title of the book and the content of the book, and your plans to, get the message out and promote it. Do you think that there's going to be a perception, let's say by the government, about it going against the narrative, the current narrative? And will that make it difficult for you to use traditional channels to promote your book? I'm thinking there might be some suppression or censorship. And I wondered if you had thought about that and if you had a backup plan.
Well, no is the short answer. I mean, I get that some in the current government, and in the chattering classes, as I call them, won't like a book that says, John A. Macdonald was not an evil ogre. That, again, there's good and bad though in John A. Macdonald. Again, I don't want to romanticize him either. But no, I mean, I think all you can do is, so far, the governments are not banning books. They may be, some librarians may be pulling some from libraries or, putting the wrong kinds of books in libraries that are, viewed by 6-year-olds, but what have you. But no, look, my job when I started this foundation and the 30 senior fellows we've got and the board and everyone else involved in it, we're going to publish what we think is relevant, factual information. We're going to try and educate the public, in the most, and I don't mean that in a condescending way. We're going to try and put facts and informed history out there. And will there be some challenges from some? Probably. I was talking with Aaron Gunn recently, who has just had one of his videos. He's a documentary filmmaker, and one of his videos, Vancouver is Dying, was seen by 3 million people. It probably had an impact on elections in Vancouver last fall. His latest video, Canada is Dying, similar to the Vancouver one, has just been kind of downgraded by YouTube or, restricted to 18 plus people, which is a way of making less people see it. I don't know what's going on there, an algorithm. There does seem to be a problem these days with getting ideas out there. To be fair, I guess, to the tech giants, there's lots of garbage on the internet too. So yeah, again, all you can do is try your best. And something, I would put it back on viewers. If you want this book, The 1867 Project, to be read by a lot of people, buy it, share it, give it to 5 of your best friends, your kids, your grandkids, people recommend it, write a review on Amazon, all the stuff that helps get it out there. It's, we just started selling it literally 2 days ago, and it's already like at 132 out of, the top books on Amazon. I'm sure within the next couple of weeks, by July 1st, it'll hit #1. But you can help get it there, right? And then all of a sudden it's not ignorable. People will go, what is this? This is interesting. Why is a book about Canada and its history defending Canada as a project #1? So all of you can certainly help with that. That's self-interested as one of the authors and the editor, but that's how you can help.
Well, I'd really like to see you target the educational system in some way. I mean, the message has to get through to our kids that they should feel proud of Canada's history, and they should understand the values on which this nation has been built, and this nation will grow and prosper. But my fear is that the kids are afraid of climate change. They're afraid to speak up. They're being told, if you don't buy into the current political narrative, then shut up. And I'm not sure that is encouraging free expression. And I don't mean free expression in the form of violence.
Yeah.
I mean free expression in the form of constructive dialogue.
Yeah. Well, we won't take a position in every issue. I mean, that requires expertise that, again, can go beyond what one's scope is, right? We will hire people that have certain specialties and expertise to look at certain issues and write about them and publicize them. But we do actually want to reach, I think the core thing, again, part of why we've started the Aristotle Foundation is to try hopefully to get, to challenge, perceptions and narratives and ideas that we think are mistaken. In essence, we want to get people to think. That's our goal. We're going to try and people, to teach people how to think, in the sense that, again, by bringing up alternatives in terms of explanations like I did on geography, right? Why Italy is dominant in the fishing fleets around the world, historically, not the Swiss. By even providing alternative explanations, you're helping people to think through an issue. So we want to get people to think and think critically. We do actually want to reach, one of our goals, Perry, is to reach 100,000 young adults and students over the next 5 years with facts and informed history. That's an explicit goal that the board will measure me on, and the other staff we have and our senior fellows on. Have you reached? And there's ways to do that. And I'm thinking out loud, perhaps we say, here's a fact sheet we've published. We'll offer a scholarship to 18-year-olds or high schoolers or, first year university or whoever. Maybe we'll offer a scholarship, create some nifty video that you can post on, your social networks, and that sort of stuff that can go viral. There's ways to reach people. And again, back to the restaurant example, I think kids aren't dumb. I mean, they know when they're getting, fed sugar and nothing else, or explanations, which are narrow and don't really capture the full gamut of human experience. So I'm pretty optimistic in that sense. I think, again, when you give people a decent meal, they go, wow, that tastes really good. My teacher told me X, but you provided a much better explanation. So, I think we'll have some success. I'm hopeful. We're not going to target the education system, so to speak, in terms of changes. I mean, that's, trying to get into curriculum or what teachers teach. I mean, we're just going to try and make the product available. Let me give you an example. 3 years ago, I had a call from someone in Toronto, a mother who was part of a parent-student council. And she said, Mark, do you have anything to counter this narrative by Black Lives Matter that Canada, again, is nothing but a racist society that should basically be canceled? And I said, look, I can send you to the United States, to Thomas Sowell. He's done some great work on race and culture and incomes. I can send you to think tanks in the US, which have some data on the US. And again, why there's more nuance, or, shows, people arrive at the same incomes when they have the same education experiences, all that kind of stuff. But I said, there's not really much in Canada. I've written a little bit about it, but what we want to do with the Aristotle Foundation is be able to give people like her and everyone else, a reference or basically, a library that's easily accessible where you can look up, okay, what about race and incomes? I mean, one of the things I did in The Victim Cult, the book I released a couple of years ago, is I looked at Indigenous incomes versus other Canadians. And the positive thing is, when again, you do an apples to apples comparison, university degree, bachelor's or above, working full year, full time, if you're between 18 and 34, so a young adult, guess what? Your income, Indigenous or non-Indigenous, is pretty much the same. So again, what does that say? It says if you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, you have a bachelor's degree, you live in the city, you'll make a good income. And it is similar. But that's encouraging. It means that's the way to get to equality, not always a result for the group, but the individual can certainly prosper. And it's that kind of data and facts. And again, facts and statistics can make people's eyes glaze over pretty quickly. I realize that. But, also stories about, again, nuance in Canadian history or success stories in Canadian history. Let me give you another one quickly. This isn't in the victim cult, but I wrote about it, or the 1867 project, but I wrote about this in a column several years ago. In 1858, about 30 Black Californians moved to Victoria, and soon they were writing to their friends and family back in California, bragging about Victoria, not just because of the blossoms in February, which everybody who moves to Victoria does and rubs it into the rest of the country. They wrote back to their friends and family in California to say, this is actually a really tolerant place. They could become citizens after 2 years. They're welcomed by the Archbishop, the Anglican Archbishop in Victoria. They were welcomed by Governor James Douglas. And I'm sure they did encounter prejudice up island, unfortunately, by some First Nations tribe. Later, more white Americans moved up to that area of southern British Columbia to Victoria. They brought with them their prejudices from the United States. That was unfortunate. But kind of, again, initially the people they encountered in Victoria seemed to be tolerant and open-minded. That's, and that comes from a history of Blacks in Canada. I forget the author's name, but, that's, again, that doesn't mean life was perfect for Black Canadians in 1858. I'm sure it wasn't. But what I love about that is it shows there was some human-to-human connection going on, and that some of the early, even colonial, settlers in Victoria were open-minded. Tell stories like that. We want that kind of stuff in our website eventually.
In one of your chapters, they talk about the Ojibwe having a very rational relationship with the settlers, and how they would sit down and have discussions about justice, righteousness, what might be done. We worked we worked together. My immigration into Canada is a byproduct of, and staying here, not coming here, but staying here, was because of that tolerance, because of that openness of discussion, because of the lack of violence as a vehicle for resolving complex issues. I still hope that's the case. And I'm delighted.
Canadians should be proud of that, right? That's the thing.
The title of the book is absolutely perfect. It's what caught my imagination was, I don't think we're going backwards. I think free expression is important. I think we're having a lot of it. I think the tensions are there. And without that tension, you're not going to learn. Yeah. But there are those that would like to close off that discussion and have a conclusion before you even start the discussion. And that's what bothers me. And I think the Aristotle Foundation is one of the vehicles coming forth. And hopefully there are others like you that say we need to keep free expression alive and well, including in our universities, including in our schools. We need critical thinking, whether it be the emergence of AI and what it might be telling us. Critical thinking is fundamental. And that means people like you helping refresh our ideas instead of finding ourselves in some postmodernistic, I know and you don't, political correctness is the future. I don't think so.
Thankfully, it's not just me. Again, there are 19 other authors in the 1867 project. There are some staff, the Aristotle Foundation and senior fellows that will draw on over time, and others to again hopefully address some of these issues. And again, it's back to, I think we can and should unite around laudable ideas in Canada in the future. And also, I think these civilizational questions never go away. What does justice look like? What does a good life look like? What kind of cities should we have? Right? I'm really interested in those questions. How can we, again, unite without damaging anyone? How can we unite around laudable concepts?
Well, hopefully Aristotle is alive and well, and we will reinforce and replicate what Aristotle would want us to do, is to have a healthy discussion on not just what is beauty, but what is Canada.
I have a question. A couple of things.
Sure.
First of all, thanks. I really enjoyed your presentation, Mark. I thought you're incredibly well-spoken and knowledgeable on all of this. And the little bit of research I did on the Aristotle Foundation in advance of this session, I was encouraged to learn that you're targeting the, I don't know if it's enlistment is the right word, but the participation of 100,000 young people in Canada, and that you're also going to use every available social media avenue to promote and to encourage the kind of thinking that you've been describing today. One question was your book title inspired in any way by the 1619 project from the United States?
Good question. Yeah, good question. Actually, so I didn't actually come up with the title. I must credit that to a friend of mine, Shannon Joseph, who's a friend of mine from Ontario, and her origins, I'm trying to remember which West Caribbean it is, but she has ancestral roots there. But Shannon had suggested the 1867 project as the name for the think tank. And I said, no, I'm going to stick with Aristotle. But I thought it was a great name for the book. And now, of course, this did come, I think, in her mind, probably from the 1619 project, which is, for those of you who don't know, I guess it was started by the New York Times, which basically argues what was fundamental to the United States was not 1776 and the Bill of Rights and everything else. It was 1619 and slavery. Now, I'm not deep enough into that issue to know which side is right, but I suspect, again, if it's the New York Times, they get a lot of things wrong these days. Nonetheless, anyway, it was the 1867 project probably was derived from that. I'm sure in Shannon's mind, if I can quasi speak for her.
Sure.
But I must credit her for the title. And then I just glommed onto it. I thought, this is great. Let's use this and talk about it in a positive sense.
Anthony, any comment or question you want to raise? Thank you for joining us today.
No, I just wanted to say a big thank you to you all, for Perry for inviting me, and Mike for such a wonderful presentation. I'm happy to be part of this webinar. It's quite interesting for me, as an immigrant who is very much interested in seeing Canada progress the way I envisioned it before I even step foot on any part of the land. So to me, it's very important that history is told in such a way as to engender positivity, and that victimhood is really killed in its infant. It's getting everything. The fact that everybody is claiming to be victims, it's really destroying the world that that we all love. So I hope to read the book. I hope to buy and send it to my friends to read. And I'm hoping that I'll be involved with the foundation, going forward.
Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you, Anthony.
I should tell a story as well about another gentleman, an immigrant, a friend of mine, Chuma, I met last fall. You may have noticed when I brought up the screen of the Aristotle Foundation, you'll see a video from Chuma, who originally came from Nigeria 20 years ago. And again, he's someone who says, look, what I found was a country of opportunity. His parents sent him here so he could accomplish his dreams and their dreams for him. And he said, and it's the same with another immigrant, Rima Azar, who's got a chapter in our book. It's the same thing with the fellow from India, Gaurav Jaswal, and why he sent his sons to Canada. And he's an entrepreneur from India. They all said, and the same thing with my friend Van Vikachalam, who I co-wrote a chapter in the book with. Again, it's interesting that immigrant Canadians are sometimes more proud of Canada these days than the chattering classes who might come from old European stock. I mean, I just find this is one of the ironies of today, that they're trashing the country, but new immigrants go, what are you doing? Like, we came here for the rule of law, for opportunity. Of course, Canada's not perfect. The country I came from isn't perfect, right? And I'm sure we all have ancestor stories like that as well, right? My grandparents on both sides came from Europe. I mean, one from Ukraine. I give that video on the Aristotle Foundation website. As a 3-year-old, they tried to come to Canada and then ended up being blocked by World War I. It took another 14 years to get to Canada, but they made it here. On my dad's side or my mom's side, they came here, and one of them came here in the 1860s after fighting in the North in the Civil War, but a German immigrant, I think, from Prussia. So, there have been, ever since the first indigenous peoples, as we call them now, crossed the Bering Plains, as they were known then, 20,000 years ago, everyone has helped create Canada. It's never been perfect. It never will be perfect. But let's not destroy the good things about Canada because we're trying to because we see a limb that's diseased. We see a problem. Well, let's chop off that limb, right? Let's prune the tree. Let's prune Canada. Let's not take down the project that has been Canada, that by and large has sheltered a lot of people, tens of millions of people, over the course of our history.
I think what you've just said is an excellent wrap up for really a terrific session. My own personal perspective, and I think one shared generally by the KEI network, is that Canada has been built on the shoulders of many institutions and many governments and many leaders. The phase that we're going through right now is appreciating the relevance of the individual and the contribution that the individual can play in furthering the development of the country. And that requires free expression. So thank you, Aristotle. Thank you, Mark. Thank you all for joining us today.